The word naysayer seems to imply it can't be done. Or, as one relative once told me, they were born genetically advantageously gifted, so that's why they have such success in life. But others say that we have limiting beliefs, and these hold us back. Yet others claim we can have a genetic component to our problems in life. Maybe, though, it's an interesting question whether genetics applies far more to our body type and gender rather than our details as per biochemical makeup, our genetic influence of nerve endings in our brain cells too, and the very structure of the brain and weight of it, size of it. Maybe what's most applicable is the premises we have been programmed with or taught, call it what you will, and perpetuated in adulthood, depending on where we end up in life, what groups, what neighborhoods, what countries, after childhood. I think right now, naysaying to me means that it can't be done, some would say. But that's upon their projecting their own experiences, their own views, their own limitations, their own failures repeatedly onto all other people. People who haven't, quote, been born, they would say, with a silver spoon in their mouth at birth. And again, they might just say, well, that silver spoon amounts to having had a lot of money in the family at birth, or going to a great college, or being given insider information from one's parents as to how businesses work or life works. Or again, genetics claims that you got a great genetic package, or even you were born beautiful as per part of that genetic package also. One might even claim was born the right sex, that men have all the power in the world. One might say thus, I was born the wrong gender, and that's all the problem. But what if limiting beliefs really, if applicable as a concept, play out in some very concrete and obvious things that maybe we don't look at so often, such as these. These coming from examples in my own life of things I've been struggling with and had to hopefully largely overcome at this point, and now consolidate and appreciate. Such that we're not only talking, I think, of naysaying being a claim it can't be done, but that the very resources available to grow sometimes are called fraudulent. In other words, maybe to refer to all courses available, all coaching, all therapists, all this and that as scams, and that everybody's just out for your money who's offering advice. Throwing out the baby with the bathwater too, i.e. ignoring that even those who put out a product that isn't so polished or on the up and up even are probably contributing something, if not simply an example of who not to steer toward the next time, what they look like physically, what they wear, what they drive, where they live, how much money they have or don't have, and where it came from, and so on. But the idea of all instruction in life being a scam, and that you simply need to sit in your basement and reinvent everything, and with no emotional support either, that could be problematic, I think. And I'd like to look at where this comes from for a second, rather than simply saying we have limiting beliefs, that being kind of vague, and maybe an overlying concept. In my own life, for instance, I've identified several key factors that really held me back from growing appreciably in life, such as anger. And I mean chronic anger, not the type, say, mentioned in Christian scriptures and maybe some other religious scriptures elsewhere, like don't let the anger go down with the sun. In other words, anger, possibly useful if you process it to the extent it doesn't handicap you on a long-term basis, and you can learn from it and use it even in a self-protective fashion. But also, this anger sometimes being very crippling, if not only chronic, but off the charts, so to speak, almost, in terms of intensity, which I think the word rage applies to, and thus sometimes also desires for revenge, which when not met, perpetuate this all the more. Along with not being able to accept some things the way they are and rescale our goals in general so that more and more of what we want does get met. Noting a wonderful Buddhist monk, John Brahm, in Australia, heading up a monastery there, has urged in some videos for us to downsize our goals, basically. Make them more feasible in general. I know next, another thing I found very crippling throughout my life, and working on it more and more, I think quite a bit of it conquered now. Call it shame, call it guilt, call it taking on too much responsibility for others' problems, call it buying into blame shifting. All this can be quite problematic and quite confusing too. I think, for instance, of the book by the psychoanalyst of the 1960s, Eric Barron, I'm Okay, You're Okay. I took just a quick spin of that book once recently. I believe the gist of it might be partly that there are two general types of people usually. Those who say they have no problems and all their pain emotionally is others' fault. And others who say the opposite. It's all my fault, by default anyway. And thus, whenever someone else says, you're the problem, they sign right on to that. I found this quite illuminated of a sort when I purchased a book and looked at it a year ago. When Pleasing You is Killing Me, by Dr. Les Carter. Another factor that really held me back quite a bit earlier in life was being bummed out oftentimes. Call it depression, if you will, but I like the phrase bummed out as referred to as a word choice to me by a fellow relative of mine, born in India, and not so acculturated to the lingo, so to speak, of emotions and the psyche as taught here by some channels in America. I would mention then that this promoted at a certain point in my life lots of oversleeping and lots of wasting of time, going to places in a ritual basis to waste time and block my mind from painful thoughts in general. Hence, the philosopher Camus and the philosopher from way back, Pascal, talk of how difficult it is for many of us not to be able to sit in a room alone with our own thoughts, but rather how we thus want lots of distractors from our painful thoughts concerning things in the past or things in the future that could happen. And of course, issues with rage, anger, and blaming can poison relationships. It can make one have a scowl on one's face, or alternatively, hide one's true feelings of this rage, even contempt, sometimes, with a chronic non-smile or a chronic smile, which some would say looks questionable, phony, plastic, not real, manipulative, and so on. And of course, some people then compensating too with a, call it, grandness of manner and putting down of others, which again is not very socially helpful and isolates oneself and contributes to that feeling again of being bummed out, inefficient, and so on. Yet another factor, often in my past, especially growing up as a youth and in my 20s, call it perfectionism, call it catastrophizing, call it in psychological parlance obsessive-compulsive disorder, I found this very crippling. And thus, when I was able to self-publish my first book about 3 years ago, one of the massive issues was getting over this perfectionism. For instance, I bought a 500-odd page book on how to upload and create, write, etc. books to Amazon. And I figured at first I was going to take a marker and pen and go from page 1 to 500, and it could take me a year. What got me over the hump in part was purchasing a $25 book, or rather course, from Stephen James of Project Life Mastery on how to write books, including a course how to write a book in 24 hours. And I actually did that once then. I went to a little bed and breakfast for $50, was all alone there, and by a little fish pond on a Friday night started dictating or writing my first book. And soon after, I conquered that 500-page manual on how to upload to Amazon by basically putting it out of the way and just like the Nike commercial says, do it, just do it. Thus pushing through the anxieties and fears, generally speaking, of not getting it right the first time or having it thus imperfect. Now, of course, another big hurdle for me was to overcome the notion you can make anything happen quickly and the first time out of the draw, so to speak. This was illuminated best, I think, by Brian Tracy, a great salesman and teacher on such, when he pointed out in about a 40-minute video on selling that nothing works right about the first 5 times. I also like the concept of iterative growth, and that you have to build like brick by brick and learn a little bit more all the time and refine. You can't just go from 0 to 100 in an instant. All of these were key lessons I had to learn, or hopefully mostly learn, nothing ever being perfect. But note, 5-10 years ago, my anxiety levels, my anger, my rage at times, unconquered, even to the extent of calling some of these issues narcissistic wounds from certain key people I either had in my past or had to live next to, almost literally. All of this crippling me so much that when I would try to read 10 years ago, I would have to read the same sentence over and over, or the same word over and over, like 3-4 times. My upshot to all of this is that my efficiency level was probably at a 2% level compared to where it is now. Hence, if this is someone else's efficiency level, surely that would be just reason for them to say it can't be done. Hence the concept of the naysayer. For if you're functioning at about 2% level, some might say you're only using 2% of your brain, but I would say it's much more a matter of functionality, of efficiency, well then of course we would say it can't be done. And that any materials out there to help us grow, or even to function just as tools, business tools, writing tools, whatever, would be called shams, fraudulent, etc., because we can't utilize them on an efficient basis. And we would always be finding thus pencils to sharpen, things to color code, files to organize, things to dust, trivialities to be done, because we don't think we can really get anywhere, and so we don't tackle the things that'll give us the biggest bang for the buck. We just don't think it would ever happen that we could get anywhere in life, and we probably wouldn't, going at the snail's pace of 2% efficiency. Another factor, thus, when I was taking some mathematics classes 20-odd years or more ago, I was so discombobulated by one American student in an upper-level class who got 99s on tests with seemingly 5 minutes preparation. And I would try, like studying hours, and get D's. I said, this is completely crazy, and I quit the class, got a D in it too, and quit the whole program, in fact, because of my level of inefficiency. And, of course, envy or jealousy, call it what you will, toward the other person, and overall confusion. Not to mention that person was 20 years younger than me, a 20-year-old, and I was 43 or so. And to make matters worse, I had had tons of therapy in the past, even some psychoanalysis. It just didn't add up and didn't seem fair. She just seemed to whip it out of nowhere, so to speak, the effort, the accomplishment, and the efficiency level. I was so confused. I can tell you now, she probably did not have the anger level, the fear level, the guilt level, the shame level, the blame level that I did. And that was very confusing to add up, seeing that I was 20-odd years older than her and had a boatload more therapy than she probably ever had, and had attended group meetings and bought tons of self-help books, spent lots of money on all of this and time, pulling my hair out. Boy, you talk about confusing. So no wonder then we might say at that juncture in our life that it can't be done. And we could be confused by relatives even who say this to us, if they are in that situation, comparatively speaking, especially if we don't realize that. Because much of what they hide, much of who they are might be hidden, even from their own knowledge, having what they call blind spots. So I'm reminded of course, how complex things are, too. And surely, thus, it takes a lot of work to gain mastery. That's not just in becoming a rocket scientist or a brain surgeon, even to the extent, say, of Ben Carson, a gifted man in brain surgery, there being a video out or movie, Gifted Hands, on him. I think this gifted nature or superlative, exquisite performance level should not be called genius. It should simply be called someone who is a high-performance individual because they have so many impediments out of the way that restricted their efficiency level. And those who are very, very non-efficient probably tend to give up comparing themselves to others and saying, this is just not worth it. For my life when I was 30-odd years old was one of such misery and such slow progress. The only thing that kept me going, working to grow, were phrases like, inch by inch, life's a cinch. By the yard, life is hard. And telling myself, at least if I'm going 1 millimeter a day, 1 inch a day, that's growth, and maybe in time it'll accelerate. Even when comparing oneself to others and seeing where they are at, much younger in life sometimes, despite what all we've done, as I outlined earlier, in so many a way, and how it just doesn't add up and doesn't seem fair, and is overall quite confusing. Another phrase, though, that kept me going was, "It ain't over till the fat lady sings." And various people who said, "Many give up just on the verge of success and didn't know that." And may later, of course, kick themselves in the behind over having given up, especially when they might later run across someone who didn't give up, and they say, "Boy, look at that person where they got. I wish I wouldn't have given up." Hence the phrase, "regrets on the deathbed." Or, as Emerson has said, maybe in the essay he wrote, Self-Reliance, kicking ourselves, so to speak, in the behind for not having the courage, maybe the courage to continue, but also the courage to act and get criticized or more. And then seeing someone who did have that and pulled way ahead, based on the same ideas we had about the concepts involved sometimes, but not being able to act on it or persist in general. That's why lately I think, how do you build your reputation? How do you build your credentials if it's not simply a degree, if any degrees at all? It seems to me a great credential is to have a portfolio that is substantial and sometimes what they call prolific. Noting that some great actors and actresses have been in so many movies, and yes, some of them considered box office flops, and yet others sometimes considered by these actors and actresses their best material simply commercial flops. Or you might say stepping stones in terms of at least what you learned, a laboratory experience. So I think to have a portfolio that is substantial in time and hence an indicator of something called sticking to it and having courage to put yourself out there, and generally being a moniker of being prolific, shows something of what I'm talking about in terms of efficiency level. For if one is not efficient, one probably won't have much of a portfolio. Hence, my father once having bought me a book when I was 30 years old on how to sell photographs, and it sat on the shelf for 20 or more years. I didn't sell one photograph. And yet all of a sudden, half a year ago, I was able to obtain a website and quickly stock it with my photographs and create a number of photo books shortly thereafter or in the same year. The time was right. Hence, in a way, I think the phrase, "when the pupil is ready, the teacher appears," I would also say thus, also, when ready, the work appears, the efficiency level appears, the portfolio appears. And the phrase also, "that person came out of nowhere." Brian Tracy referring to that about Lady Gaga, for instance, who was once waiting tables. And the same about Marie Forleo doing the same thing at one time, her having written a very fascinating and successful book, Everything is Figure-Outable. Another book I once bought, I think entitled The Long Shot. I like too, considering a video I've watched on Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a very famous and in some circles praised former president during the Depression era of the United States. A man, by the way, who had polio and strove to overcome it his whole life, as well as the fears involved having polio, especially the fear of not being able to escape a room if it caught on fire, a building on fire, while having polio. Eleanor Roosevelt particularly mentioned as someone having had a very challenging past as per childhood, but as that changed, she became a powerhouse in terms of efficiency, in terms of productivity, a driving force. Regardless of whether you argue one way or the other how much you would agree with her policies or views, what have you, it was not questionable that she didn't have strong drive and so on. The same for Thomas Edison, who was, I think at an early age, almost deaf. And yet, he had his Menlo Park laboratory in New Jersey, where he had, for instance, if I remember correctly, some 40 tables with one project on each, and he would walk from one table to the next each day, working on each project. And he came up with over 1,000 inventions by the time he died, including, of course, the light bulb. He was, again, a dynamo, despite his handicap. Or might I say, because of his handicap. The same for Eleanor Roosevelt. And I would say my handicaps too. Whatever driving them, producing lots of anger, lots of guilt, shame, inefficiencies thus in general. And my own version then of saying it can't be done as per my hopes for the future being very, very bright, as opposed to having some degree of hope to keep plugging away. One last mention. Dr. Sigmund Freud, whom some used to love tremendously, and his reputation tarnished in many circles, I think still had some very key prescient concepts. One of them was the importance of work, and one of them was love. However you would define these, there also being a book entitled something like this, To Work and Love, if I think is correct title. At any rate, the word work, I believe, especially alluding to the concept of being very efficient at your work and enjoying it so much that you don't even call it work, even if you're spending 70, 80, 100 hours a week at it. I like Ken Atchison's book, or audiobook I have, listening to it lately, I think entitled, How to Quit Your Day Job. He calls such people type C personalities, not A or B personalities, because he says they work so hard and yet they enjoy it. And it's not basically that stressful. I don't think it shoots your blood pressure through the roof. In part, I would say, because you probably have a very minimal level of fear and anxiety, which, contrary, is what drives, I think, the type A personality. Who, by the way, probably regards every setback with frustration, i.e. anger, thus driving your blood pressure through the roof. Not to mention confrontations at work. So if one is, relatively speaking, saddled with all of these issues, and as per theory and psychology in America, having blind spots, some saying in these circles that this is part and parcel of personality disorders, that you don't understand your limitations, thus I would phrase it. You're blind to these limitations. May even think your problems are only cosmetic, calling it, say, perfectionism, but perfectionism being an advantage, you tell yourself. And that otherwise you simply have basically wrinkles as per your flaws, personality-wise. Seems to me thus then, it's quite understandable the concept of naysaying as to thinking you can't do much more, ever. Others can't either. Hence telling someone else or thinking oneself 90% of businesses fail. Repeated attempts at businesses fail for all people. Maybe the first, second, third business, the first, second, third blog or podcast may fail, but only as learning steps. Actually not typically called failure then. Maybe we need to rephrase that whole word. But the person of one type, having less and less issues that I've been talking about, and more growth then in not only efficiency level, but understanding people in general. And I think thus why it took Colonel Sanders of Kentucky 1,009 times trying to sell chicken while traveling in his car, sometimes sleeping in it before what he called success. Selling the chicken and later also in the movies, his having been in a number of movies, in fact, and getting great acclaim in general. I would posit Colonel Sanders probably learned more and more about people and conquered more and more anger, guilt, shame, whatever issues were making his efficiency levels quite low and his relationships with people not so hot, until one day that magic sale of his secret recipe, that wasn't probably finding just that perfect person to sell it to, or that certain magic phrase to convey the attributes of chicken. It was getting to the point where his relationships were the best ever, and his efficiency level also the best. If he hadn't been able to keep at it, then I suppose this wouldn't have been possible. Maybe that's what separates the men from the boys, those who don't quit, no matter what. They pick themselves up and dust themselves off, no matter if it's a day, a week, a month, a year, and they keep on till the fat lady really does sing. That is the story of my life. I know that. And I see more now and now how those who have told me it can't be done, including what they call dreams, or even starting a business, that businesses fail for all people 90% of the time in all attempts at them. That's a very questionable comment in and of itself, I believe. And it doesn't take into account who gives up eventually and who does not. For if you don't give up, I suppose you will eventually start to conquer one or more basic roadblocks that have been holding you back so much, and in turn conquer so much more anger, guilt, shame, bitterness, blaming that holds back our efficiency levels and ability to relate well with people. One last comment being, I like the words of Napoleon Hill, and maybe Dale Carnegie has said this too in his book How to Win Friends and Influence People, when he talked about the importance of a smile amongst other things. It being said by Napoleon Hill at least, or Andrew Carnegie in contact with him, that what is most important in business and probably life is relationships and interacting with people on a harmonious basis, or I would say at least treating people with respect, no matter whether you agree or not, whether they are, quote, your opponent or not, that this respect, and I would say conveyed often in a smile as opposed to not a smile, and also not using a chronic smile to hide something or another, is very crucial. These are the thoughts then of a 61-year-old person who was quite hamstrung for most of his life, but much and much less as time went on, until watershed moments came. If those listening are a Christian also, or not, there is a phrase from the Bible, I think, that is applicable of a sort. You shall know them by their fruits. Maybe including fruits of productivity, fruits of effortlessness, some would call it, fruits of clear-mindedness, and of course, fruits of good human relationships. Fruits of things just clicking along, whereupon once they were the fruits of having a ball and chain on your ankle, so to speak, and you're just dragging along in life at what I would call a 2% level of efficiency, relatively speaking. One might thus call this also coming out of nowhere, or being discovered, if one were in, say, the Hollywood industry. Thoughts to consider here once again.